To Adjust Inc. presents If Testimony Was a Person, the podcast where we talk to professionals who have a personal and professional testimony with an emphasis on equity and inclusion. Today we have not just a social worker, but a healer, a person who believes in using different modalities to do the healing.
Yes.
Brooklyn native,
Yes.
still a Brooklyn representative, Miss Stephanie Shelton.
Yes.
Good to meet you and good to talk with you, Stephanie.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. I am passionate about mental health, and I am passionate about mental health for women. You know, Naire's House is a new organization that was founded based on one of my daughters being murdered. That is what brought this about. And I didn't want to do anything like related to domestic violence because I believe that based on some of the decisions that I made in my life, a lifestyle that I led, and how I raised children through my own trauma impacted them. And, you know, she made some choices in her life based on trauma, not necessarily domestic violence.
Right. So it's different angles to
Yes.
hit on things.
Yes.
And what you saw was that leading up to domestic violence is often trauma, and you wanted to take that approach.
Yes.
Help that.
Yes. Yes.
And my condolences for the tragedy that you endured. Can you give us an idea of when you lost your daughter and the journey that you've had in starting Naire's House?
Sure. So, when you lose anyone in your life, it's devastating. But to lose a child, I think, is so impactful because the mind never registers that you're going to be burying your child. Your mind is just set up that you're going to go first, and so you are going to pour into these vessels that will be able to carry on, you know, once you're no longer here. And I didn't expect it.
Of course.
You know, I just did not, and I didn't expect that, you know, at all. And the incident happened in 2019, and very soon after, we went into the pandemic.
Right.
So I wasn't around family, you know, I wasn't out doing things. So I was kind of like sheltered, like I was in my own grief and mourning. And then in 2021, you know, things began to open up. We began to move around more, but began to be around my family more and going to events that were family centered. And it became very obvious that my daughter wasn't there. And believe it or not, it was in 2021 that I began to feel the loss and begin to feel the mourning. And, you know, of course, I was involved in support groups. You know, I have my place of worship that was very supportive, you know, my family, very supportive. But I felt like there was something that I needed to do that was internal, that was very personal just to me in order to heal. And Naire's House, you know, came about. And initially when I started off, I was gung-ho, and then I stopped because I had to get in touch with so many of my feelings. And I kept tapping places that I had not even touched and had not healed, and I kept backing up. But one thing about healing is we feel in order to heal, and that healing is not necessarily a mind thing. Like I can't use thinking to heal something that I feel. I have to feel it.
Yeah.
Trauma is an experience, so healing has to be an experience. It has to be something that I learn how to feel, embrace, accept, and still move on in my life without winding up in the fetal position every time I think of my daughter, every time something triggers me. I can't go and hide. I still have to live this life, and it is what she would want me to do.
Correct.
She would want me to live.
That's beautiful. All of what you said, particularly that thinking is not the totality of healing. It can help to think the right thoughts, but healing is an experience, and that was very insightful. So spell that for the folks who may want to look up Naire's house.
It's Naire house. Naire's house.
And organized as a corporation or 501?
Incorporation, and we are an alternative to traditional mental health. That's what we are about. I think that sometimes we get so far away from our own ancestry, the things that have worked for us and have been proven to work for us. We've gotten so far away from that. Like in our communities, we are raised up with the concept of what happens in this house stays in this house. So how do you then go and spill your all to somebody else? How do you go and talk to someone where there is not even a clear representation? Like there's not a whole bunch of Black men and women doing therapy, and providing therapy. And our goal is to bring those services into the underserved communities for Black women. We are, as a people, as a culture, we are accustomed to drums. Like we know what drumming is about.
That's right.
We know what dance and movement is about. If you take a look at religion, and our spirituality, and especially in my age group, growing up in the church, you could get lost in your spirit and your connection through the music, through song, through the swaying of the body, like feeling really connected. And that doesn't have to stay within the four walls of the church or anyone's place of worship. Why can't we just do that as a community and do it in community?
Right.
Journaling, is very important, that we get to write about the things that we feel and that we've experienced. Because for some of us, our voice has been robbed. We were not allowed to speak. We were not allowed to share some of the things that impacted us. I know in particular in my household, because we grew up in church and that was my parents' focus, we were told to pray about it. When you're 8 years old and something is bothering you, there's no real connection with, I'm going to pray about it and all is going to be well.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, we need to learn ways to get our voice back, to write about those things, to have movement, music, sound, all of that. Those are the alternatives that we are familiar with and that we can use so that we can heal.
I think you are so correct. I've often said that being a mental health practitioner, I feel like we help a lot of people. But I've often said, but what about the people who can't talk it out? Because these other modalities really speak to a part of us that's been present for a long time.
Yes.
And if you don't have healing through those modalities, then you are missing. You're missing some parts of healing.
Right. And in these times, we have so many people that are here that are undocumented, that do not have insurance, do not have those means that we are familiar with and that we have access to. Do those people get left behind?
Right.
Is it fair that that black and brown sister gets left behind because they don't have access,
Correct.
because they don't speak the language? One thing about drumming and music and dance, you don't have to have a language. The body creates the talk, the body
Absolutely.
creates the conversation.
And so I'm gonna go back a little bit, and so we mentioned that you were from Brooklyn.
Yes.
Where are you from in Brooklyn?
Well, I was raised up in Red Hook Projects. I was raised up in the projects. I graduated from John Jay High School. I grew up in a home where there was a foundation laid for us, a belief system, standards, morals. And at the age of 16, I became pregnant. And based on my being pregnant, I was very, very involved in church. And when I became pregnant, I couldn't sing in the choir anymore. Had to sit in the back of the church. And, a lot of my girlfriends and a lot of the things that were positive in my life that I was previously engaged in, I couldn't be engaged in anymore due to being pregnant. And, some of my friends, their parents didn't want them to be around me anymore. And because they felt like I was this horrible influence
Yeah.
and they didn't want them around me. And back then, you could not remain in a public high school pregnant. So we were sent to a young mother's school where everyone there was pregnant. So you're separated from your community. You feel like you're in isolation. And because I didn't have those positive supports around other than my immediate family, I drifted off into, those crowds of people that were doing different things. So it started off with my drinking, which eventually led to years of heroin use. And I used intravenously. Like, I wasn't a person that just sat and sniffed heroin. I used intravenously for years. And that led to, my mom, taking over with the parenting because I was having children. I had 3 daughters. And so my mother stepped in, my sisters stepped in. And although my family meant well, they were protecting my children.
Yeah.
That gave me, to me, that was the sign,
Freedom.
freedom.
Yeah.
Do what it is that you do, and that's what I did. And that separation of parent from child, my children were impacted by that, and impacted heavily. There was a lot of years between my mother and my children's age.
Yeah.
But my mother did an excellent job. She did an excellent job, with my children. And it got to the point where I couldn't go any lower. I was tired of the lifestyle that I was living. And, I just cried out to God, like, I can't do this, but I don't know what to do, And I'm grateful for the foundation that was laid.
Yeah.
Like, when I got up in the morning, I saw my mother on her knees praying. My mother she was the model for what a woman should be, what a parent should be. She set those examples, for me and my sisters.
Let me just say this. It is an amazing contrast in experiences that you came up in this household that you describe as ideal in the sense of the standards that were laid for you and, beliefs and behaviors that you saw modeled, right? But isn't it something that you were separated from your peers in a way that makes it so that you looked at almost as a bad person for being pregnant at as a teenager, and I do remember those days very well when parents would send their pregnant daughters down south. You're going to stay in North Carolina. It was almost like you had scarlet letter or something.
Yeah.
And you were to be, there was no way that you were to be regarding that in a positive way. It was a loss or a failure of some kind. And, you talking about that just reminds me that people who are isolated are apt to do things that don't show success. It shows that
Right.
they are looked at as a failure. Yeah.
And I lived for years believing that God had set me in the back of the church, that God was totally
Right.
displeased with
Wow.
me.
Yeah.
That was the message that I received at 16. And it took a lot of years for me to realize that man did that we had created our own social construct that says if you do this, you're out of pocket, you're bad, you can't belong with the good crew, anymore. But it took me years to figure that out. And I was able to step back onto a foundation that had been laid. I was able to step back onto something that was solid, something that worked.
Ah, that's a great analogy. So you slipped off into a situation that wasn't good, but because a foundation was
Yes.
laid,
Yes.
you were able to
Yes.
step back onto something solid.
I wouldn't be where I'm at today if that foundation were not laid for me.
Yeah.
Because I would have stepped back into nothingness. And
Right.
who needs that? And, I, got involved with a support group. I stayed clean. I recovered. My life began to change. And it's amazing how God knows what is before us. See, I didn't know that in 2019 my daughter was going to be murdered.
Right.
I didn't know that I was going to have to step up and be there for my two other daughters and for a grandson. My daughter left a son here. And everything that I've been through, has all been used because I'm wise in ways that maybe had I not gone through some of those situations, I would not have accumulated the wisdom.
Yeah.
So I got myself together, went back to school, got my degree in social work, went on to get my license.
Yeah, give me more about that. So, approximately how old are you when you get clean?
When I got clean, I was in my 40s.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And then in your 40s, you realized what you wanted to do.
Yeah.
And how did you come about social work? Did you know almost right away I need to?
I think I've always had, and that was part of, I think, my fight with active addiction was I always knew that I had a good heart. I always knew that I wanted to help people. I always knew that was in me, and I felt like I was being robbed of that.
Yeah.
I felt like what I knew about myself, someone else was telling me wasn't true.
Yeah.
They were saying that I was useless, I was worthless, counted me out. So I got clean, I went to work, I started doing things, and we have to do esteemable things in order for our esteem to increase. So I started doing things that, like self-care and doing things in the community, doing things that mattered, doing things that supported other people. That's what I began to do. And then I just said to myself, Stephanie, you know who you are.
So you had gotten your bachelor's around when?
After I got clean.
After you got clean.
Yeah.
This is an amazing story.
No, all of this stuff I did after I got clean. Prior to that, I was just a high school grad.
I have known people that struggled with addiction, and sometimes, even when people get clean, well, just from the little experience I have in their 30s, it is hard to just start working if they hadn't been doing it before, or hard to get into school. I know that, if some people are not academic people, quote unquote, and
Yeah.
so that would be more difficult. But I suppose just thinking about your story, you had been working as a young person,
Right.
and so you kind of had that ethic already. That might be part of the stepping back onto something solid.
Yeah.
Right? You kind of already had that, and you had already built a confidence in being a student before your bout with heroin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And going back to school was very different because I was a lot older
Right.
than the other people in
Oh
the
yeah.
class.
Oh yeah.
And, like when I first started out, I was like, Stephanie, what was you thinking? These are kids. Like, what were you thinking? But I stuck with it. And believe it or not, those young people helped me.
Mm-hmm.
They called me Miss Stephanie.
I can imagine that.
We got you, Miss Stephanie. Don't worry about it, Miss Stephanie. And really encouraged me, really helped me. And once you get that ball rolling, once you get that energy going again, you become unstoppable.
Where'd you go for the bachelor's?
To Empire State College. And then I went on to Hunter for my master's, and I got my license.
Oh, that's very prestigious. The Hunter School
Yeah.
of, was that Silverman School of Social
Yes,
Work?
the Silverman School of Social Work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And graduated with honors. I want to add
Oh, of course
that.
you did. Of course you did. That is
Yeah.
really wonderful. And you kind of knew that you wanted to do therapy. And what did you get into in terms of your first job out of graduate school?
Well, while I was in graduate school, I was working in the field of substance use. Like I've had my KSAC for years.
Okay.
That was my initial foray into going back
right.
to work.
Yeah.
I was like, I have the experience, I understand it. I know the challenges and the barriers, so let me do that. So I worked in the field of substance use, outpatient programs, inpatient programs. So I was working for an offshoot of the Human Resource Administration, like doing the assessments to determine when that person applied for public assistance,
Right.
to determine the level of care that they needed, outpatient, inpatient, detox rehab. And that's what I was doing while I was in school.